we have the pleasure of having the majority leader, Eric Luedtke. For some of us, we call him Professor, come and share knowledge and discuss how we can champion causes through advocacy as a school. And one of the things we're going to focus on today is House Bill 156, in particular because this is directed towards students and how we can vote on campus. So without further ado, I don't want to take up too much time talking. I'm going to allow Professor / Majority Leader Eric Luedtke give us a little bit of background, and we'll get started with our advocacy session.
Cool. Yeah. First of all, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everybody who's joined us. I'm looking forward to answering your questions in a little bit. As Aisha mentioned, I'm an associate clinical professor on campus. I mostly do work on campus on state and local government, and teach classes on racial equity and policymaking, and on issues around leadership and leadership theory. In my other job, I serve in the Maryland House of Delegates, where Speaker Adrian Jones, called on me a little over a year ago now to become majority leader in the House of Delegates. But I was asked to come talk today about one bill in particular, which has to do with election law. And I've been involved with election law issues frankly, since before I was elected. I was an activist in my community, and that was the sort of pre-2010 years, when the state was just getting into no-fault absentee balloting and opening early voting sites and that kind of thing. And I've continued that advocacy in the legislature, and I'm a true believer in democracy. And I think for democracy to work, everybody has to have the ability to have a say. And, we've never actually had that as a country. We've never had a system where everybody really has an opportunity to have their voice heard in the electoral process. And we've made steady progress on that over time, expanding the right to vote to, people who didn't hold property in the early 1800s, eventually to women in the early 20th century, and in the mid 20th century, finally passing the Voting Rights Act to make sure that people of color were really able to exercise their right to vote. But there are other barriers that exist in our voting processes that make it hard for people to cast a ballot. And so, over time, we in the legislature have tried to chip away at some of those barriers through a number of ways, expanding early voting so that people who work long hours and can't vote on election day have an alternative, expanding what we don't refer to absentee voting in Maryland anymore. Maryland doesn't have absentee voting. It's called mail-in voting now by act of the legislature, because you don't have to be absent to request a mail-in ballot. You can request one for any reason. I was a sponsor a few years ago now with Senator Will Smith in passing legislation, two pieces of legislation, one called the Freedom to Vote Act and one called the Secure and Accessible Registration Act, that made Maryland an automatic voter registration state. So people, when they interact with state government, are not only given the opportunity to register to vote, but it's assumed that they will register to vote unless they specifically opt out, which has helped to increase the number of people that are on our voter rolls and prevent people from having to use provisional ballots. And we've passed same-day voter registration now. So, this year, I think we're going to see a lot of legislation related to voting rights. And in some states, that's legislation that will seek to make it harder for people to vote, unfortunately. And we're seeing that, across the country now. In some states, even proposals to allow state legislators to appoint some of the presidential electors, which would be, a fundamental violation of democratic principles. But I think in Maryland, what we're going to see is passage of legislation to expand the franchise. And there's a number of bills that are being discussed, bills to make permanent some of the lessons we learned during the COVID election last year, putting mail-in ballot drop boxes in front of all sorts of local facilities to make it easier for people to vote by mail. We've learned some lessons about making it easier for folks to go through the same day voter registration process. We're going to have legislation to expand early voting further, particularly in counties that have seen significant increases in the proportion of their residents taking advantage of early voting. But the bill I was asked to specifically speak to is called the Student and Military Voter Empowerment Act. And it's a bill that's been a couple years in the making. It was developed as a result of conversations that I had with students on campus and with advocates who work on behalf of student voting rights. There are some populations who, not necessarily because of a race or socioeconomics, but because of their occupational status, have unique barriers to voting, and students are one of them. Students, you have many of you a place you call home that often isn't campus, but during the election time, you are living on campus. A lot of students come from very far away to live on campus and have questions about how should I register to vote? Can I register to vote in Maryland? Should I register to vote at home? Once I register to vote, how do I get access to a mail-in ballot? Will there be a polling place on campus? And these are questions that, in election season, I get from my students all the time. We do a great job in this country teaching people about the branches of government and checks and balances, and we do a terrible job actually teaching people how to vote. So that's the original premise behind the bill, is that it should be a responsibility, a core responsibility of college campuses as part of their responsibility to civic education, to make sure that students are informed of their rights as voters. And the bill would require every campus to have a student voting coordinator. University of Maryland College Park already has one. Our campus is actually kind of one of the handful of campuses in Maryland that are leading the way. I would call out, by the way, in those ranks, MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art, which has consistently had over 90% student voting in elections, which is extraordinarily high. So campuses were required to have a student voting coordinator and a student voting plan that was developed in consultation with faculty and staff and students. They would be required to provide information to students about how to register to vote and how to actually vote. The local boards of elections would be required to consult with college campuses about locations of polling places to provide more opportunities for essentially advocacy on behalf of polling places proximate to where students actually live. We would also, for the first time in Maryland law, give students the right to take an excused absence from class to cast their ballot. That's a right that exists now if you have a job. If you work in Maryland, your employer has to give you a 2-hour unpaid absence from work in order to go cast your ballot, but students don't have that right. So we want to make that available to them. And then, so last year, we, as many of your policy students, I know, it takes multiple years often to get a bill through, and you learn things along the way. And one of the lessons we learned last year was a political lesson that, the bill as written might not necessarily attract Republican votes. I'm a Democrat. It's always better if you can get bipartisan support for election legislation. And part of the reason for that was just perception. Some of my Republican colleagues perceived me as pushing the bill because students tend to be a more sort of Democratic leaning constituency or left leaning constituency generally. And, I believe in voting rights for everyone. I don't care if you vote for me or not, you should have a right to vote. So over the interim, over the 9 months between our legislative sessions, I worked actually with one of my Republican colleagues on adding some things to the bill, including provisions that particularly address some of the needs of folks that are serving in the military as active duty military personnel. And the bill does that in a couple of ways. That same provision about local boards of elections have to consult with college campuses. Well, the same thing would be true of military bases with residential housing in Maryland, of which we have a number. You got to remember also that a lot of the folks that are serving in the military, a lot of enlisted personnel, are the same age as folks that are attending four-year universities, right? They likewise never necessarily had someone explaining to them how to, register to vote and cast a ballot and that kind of thing. A few years ago, Congress passed a law that created what's called the Federal Voter Assistance Project, which tries to correct that for military voters, tries to provide that same type of support that we're asking college campuses to do in the bill. And we reached out to them and said, what can we do to help? And they said one of the most important things we could do was allow military personnel serving overseas to register to vote electronically using something called the federal postcard application, which is it's a uniform voter registration application that every state in the US accepts in paper format, but many states do not accept electronically. And the problem with that is that we've got a lot of personnel that are serving relatively distant from, an APO, an Army post office, or an embassy or consulate, which might have mail service. So it could take a very long time for a mail voter registration form to make its way to the Maryland State Board of Elections, and it might be past the deadline. So, we worked into the bill some language to deal with that problem, to allow the electronic registration of voters through the federal postcard application. And so, it's been an interesting exercise in coalition building, and I think has made the bill a better bill. And we had our hearing on the House side last week, and the hearing went very well. In fact, so well that the one person that was signed up to testify against it, when it got to be her turn to speak, she changed her testimony and said, "You know what? I support this bill now," because the students who came to testify, in particular from College Park's SGA and SGAs on other campuses, and the veterans who showed up to testify in favor of it on behalf of the military voting provisions, did such a good job of explaining the problem and how this bill will address it. So, the job of, legislating is an incremental job, right? Policymaking is often incremental, particularly if you're trying to make policy as an individual member of a legislature instead of, say, a governor or president introducing a bill where you have an incredible bully pulpit that you can rely on. So, this is incremental. It's a step in the right direction, and cycle after cycle, we're going to have to make the case for continued expansion of voting rights. And we'll take some of those steps this year, and we'll see them in effect for our next elections in 2022. And then we'll have at it again after that election and try to expand the franchise in 2024 and go from there. The key part of success in this bill has, frankly, not been anything I've done. I like to think I'm a pretty good legislator, but there are a lot of, smart people that serve in the legislature that have a good understanding of election law and could build a bill like this, right? What's really carrying the bill forward has been the advocacy, in particular from students who can make the case in a way that I can, and who, frankly, I'm a politician. People don't always trust politicians. People, as you heard earlier, may believe that I have partisan motivations in something I'm doing. It's harder to make that accusation against, a member of an SGA who says, "Look, I just want to be able to vote," right? Or, a veteran who says, "Look, we're just trying to make sure that military service members who are defending our country can have a say in who leads that country," right? So it's really the coalition of advocates that has developed out around the bill and has organized around the bill that has carried the bill as far as it has. And the subcommittee that is considering this bill, the election law subcommittee, has it on their calendar, their agenda for tomorrow. And I'm hopeful we'll see it move out of committee in the next couple of weeks and then move across the floor, where I'm hopeful that this year we'll have a pretty strong bipartisan vote, and then move through the Senate, where it died last year on a very close vote. It lost by 1 vote in Senate committee. I'm hopeful we'll have a very different result this year. But that's the short story on the bill. I'm happy, Aisha, whatever you want, or in response to questions, to talk more about sort of advocacy in Annapolis and how people can engage in that process. I'm happy to talk more about election law. I'm happy to just, answer any questions that anyone has at all, if they'd like.
Before we move on to questions,
Sure.
we speak about the advocacy piece in Annapolis, and then
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I come to Annapolis as somebody who, frankly, I grew up advocating in Annapolis. I was originally trained in high school as an environmental advocate, as an organizer by the Sierra Club. I think when most Americans think of government, they think of the federal government, and the federal government operates very differently than the state. And the advocacy work that happens in Annapolis is much more grassroots driven than at the federal level. And so, we as legislators, the vast majority of the legislation we pass is brought to us by an advocate and then is supported by an advocate. And of course, some of those advocates are paid lobbyists who work on behalf of corporations or whomever can afford to hire them. But a lot of them are citizen advocates, citizen activists. And like any legislative body, Annapolis has its own culture, its own processes, which to become a really effective advocate, it takes time to sort of learn the culture and processes. So when you're first getting involved in advocacy, it's a really good idea to kind of tag along with some of the organizations that are doing advocacy work, right? So on, election law, I'm working with a number of organizations, including, as I mentioned, the Student Government Associations, but also Common Cause Maryland, the League of Women Voters, the Maryland Military Alliance, Black Girls Vote, a number of these voting rights groups. But any area of policy you're interested in advocating around, there are organizations that are working in that area. And you can kind of, they'll often have advocacy days where they'll bring a large group of advocates to Annapolis. Now, of course, they're not doing it physically to Annapolis right now because of the pandemic, but we do Zoom. And they will often provide training to participants ahead of time. So if you've never lobbied before, they'll teach you how to do it, right? So, and a lot of organizations have developed very effective ways of bringing large numbers of people down and training them how to advocate. Casa de Maryland, which is an immigrants' rights advocacy group whose headquarters is located right down the street from the campus. They are, one of the best. The Maryland State Education Association that represents teachers and other educators do a great job with it too. The Moms Demand Action, which has totally changed the conversation on gun safety laws, similarly. Right. And frankly, the NRA on the other side as well. I just in terms of, as a legislator, I'll say this: if there's a law that you think needs to be changed in the state of Maryland, you can change it. Like, you can change it. A lot of the laws that I pass literally come from a constituent calling me up and saying, "Hey, can we sit down for a conversation at a Panera or Starbucks or something?" And they'll have an issue that they want addressed. And my job is to help them figure out how best to address it. Sometimes it's a bill, sometimes it's a phone call to a secretary of a state department. But because I'm, first of all, a part-time legislator, our legislature is part-time, and because my district is relatively small, it's relatively easy for individual constituents to meet with me. It's relatively easy for you to meet with any of your legislators. And then, that's the first step in the policy process, right? Like, that's how you get a new idea introduced. And from there, anytime you want to effectively advocate for policy in Annapolis, it's helpful to build a coalition, to find like-minded groups, to find other organizations that might be helpful in promoting your cause. And it helps to think broadly there. It helps to think through the messaging, how you're going to make the case for your bill. The biggest mistake that new activists and new advocates make is they only think about their arguments, about what I'm going to argue, right? But they don't think about counter arguments. So what is somebody else going to say if they oppose my bill, and how do I respond to that, right? That's a really important part of your thinking as you advocate too. And then, in Annapolis itself, there are really, we have 188 members between the two chambers, 141 in the House, 47 in the Senate. But, on any given issue, there are really only a handful of people whose votes have a very strong influence over that issue. And that's because a lot of our work is done in committee. So, if you're working with a legislator on a bill, you want to, seek change on it, it's good to have that conversation. Who on your committee matters? Who are the people who I need to talk to, right? Sometimes it's the chairman of the committee, and it's hard to get an appointment with them. That can happen. Sometimes it's not, right? So let me, I've been talking in kind of general terms. Let me narrow in more specifically on an example. A couple of years ago now, I had a constituent reach out to me by Facebook Messenger and said, "Hey, you know, I don't think the schools do a good enough job teaching about LGBTQ history. I'd like to talk to you about it. I said, sure. So we got together at the Tech Road Panera in Silver Spring and sat down at a table. And, you know, he had brought along a copy of a piece of legislation from another state that mandated that their schools develop standards for LGBTQ history as part of their United States history curriculum in school. And I said to him, again, going back to my point earlier, every legislature has a unique culture and a unique way of doing things. I said, in Maryland, the legislature traditionally does not pass laws mandating curriculum, because it's been sort of the longstanding belief of legislators here that we're politicians. We shouldn't be making the choices about what should be taught. That's a choice that should be made by professional educators and parents and school board members, right, who actually have the expertise to know what's important to teach. So I said, you know, I could introduce a bill for you, but it's not going anywhere. And if you want to get it done, the better thing for us to do is do what's called a sign-on letter, where I will put together a letter. I'll draft a letter and run it by you, and we'll work back and forth till we get a letter you're comfortable with. And we will send it to the State Department of Education and the state school board. And I will ask as many of my colleagues as want to sign their names to the letter with me. And that's what we did. In order to try to expand the coalition, we looked at the US history standards in Maryland and asked, are there other groups besides LGBTQ Marylanders whose history doesn't really show up in the curriculum? And it turned out there were standards related to Black history and Latino history, but no standards related to the history of the disability rights movement. So we wrote a sign-on letter that said, you know, Maryland needs to do a better job creating standards for LGBTQ history and the history of disability rights. And we got, you know, I think it was like 70 some members of the legislature to sign on to it. We sent the letter and put it out over social media. It got some news coverage. I got some hate mail, which tends to happen. And then, you know, the state superintendent a few weeks later wrote back and said, you know what? We're actually in the process of revising our US history curriculum right now. We can absolutely do this. And they did. And it was, you know, it's that simple, right? But it didn't start with me. It started with a citizen activist who said, hey, we've got a problem, let's fix it. And who came to me and who continued working with me throughout the process. So Aisha, is that kind of, you other stuff in the advocacy direction you want me to talk about?
Actually, I think we're going to open it up a little bit for questions and kind of see what some people are interested in learning about. So if you could please raise your hand so that we can unmute you and allow you to speak.
Does anyone in the audience have questions? Feel free to hit the raise hand button to the bottom right of your screen, and we'll bring you up for your questions. Well, I have a question. I think everybody's being a little shy, so I'll just ask. Hi, Professor Luedtke. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us this evening. You spoke in one of my classes a couple of months ago, and that was very interesting. Well, not a couple of months, it was 2 years ago, it was before COVID. My question is, what do you think we as policy students can do more to promote greater advocacy, given, you know, the current state of politics, and, you know, after the election, we do see a lot of polarizing forces in America right now. What do you think as policy students specifically we can do to promote greater advocacy, to make sure our voices are heard, and so forth?
Here's a great question. And so let me take a step back also. Before I came to the university, I was a middle school history teacher. So I apologize for my constant references to history, but I can't help it. Every major social movement in America has been driven by students in the history of this country, right? I mean, the abolition movement, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement. It's always the peace movement. I almost forgot the peace movement in the 60s and 70s. The Black Lives Matter. It's always been young people leading the charge, always, right? I think students often don't have a sense of their own power. Students are powerful. Because of that history, and because, you know, there are large numbers of students in a relatively concentrated space like a college campus, which reduces one of the biggest barriers to organizing, which is just the opportunity to interact with other people. And, you know, the reality of organizing social change, it's not as complicated as it seems. And look, there are fantastic trainings related to organizing and advocacy out there for those of you who want to look into them. I would particularly recommend any training that is in any way related to an organization called the Midwest Academy, which grew out of the direct action organizing model of a guy named Saul Alinsky. That, for example, is the model of organizing that Barack Obama was trained in when he was a community organizer. It's the model I was trained in. But, you know, it's not rocket science. Cesar Chavez, maybe the great, you know, Latino union leader, maybe put it best. He was asked once, like, how he, you know, created the change he created. He said, I just talked to one person and then another person and then another person, right? So how can students take advantage of this moment and sustain movements for change? You know, first of all, keep talking to people, and not just within your circle, but more broadly, right? Try to get them on board, try to get them to support your efforts. You know, participating in elections matters. And, you know, consistently, people in your age group have not voted in numbers as high as other age groups. And that warps our politics. It means that, you know, a politician who is concerned about re-election is going to pay more attention to the AARP, which represents retired people who vote in large numbers, than it does to the SGA, right? But we've seen a shift over the last 4 years where we've seen a massive, and I mean truly massive, increase in voter participation by college age people, by Black voters, by low income voters, all across the country. And if that can be sustained, that is going to fundamentally rewrite the decision-making that happens in our politics. And, you know, on top of that, I think I'm going to make a pitch that advocacy can't just be about showing up in Annapolis and advocating. It's also about finding candidates who you agree with and supporting them. And that doesn't have to mean contributions, although it can. You know, that can mean knocking on doors. You know, we've seen when I first got to the legislature 10 years ago, the average age of a member of the House of Delegates was probably in the upper 2000s. You know, we had people who, you know, there was a state senator who was in the Senate when I first got elected, who had been in the Senate long enough that he not only voted against the legalization of interracial marriage in Maryland back in the 1960s, but also voted against the legalization of gay marriage in Maryland in 2012. That's how long this guy was around. We've seen a huge generational shift over the last couple election cycles, and it has changed the policy we're making in Annapolis. And it's because a younger cohort of legislators has gotten elected that have very different priorities, right? That believe in a lot of the values that I think some of you probably believe in, like, you know, racial equity, that, you know, we've got serious problems in this country with actually providing equality of opportunity. And so, I mean, that matters too. So that may be a lot more than you were asking, but, you know, that first step of saying, I'm going to get involved, I'm going to write a letter, I'm going to cast my ballot, I'm going to support this candidate, like that first step is huge, and every step after that is huge.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much for answering my question. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, Professor Falk, you are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Eric, just a simple question on your voting bill. What are the protections against a student voting both on campus and in their home state by mail?
Yeah, so the state of Maryland participates in a national network that most states participate in now called ERIC, which I, of course, love the name of it. I don't remember what it stands for, but they are constantly comparing voter rolls to make sure that they scrub voters who might be registered in more than one place. And that happens on a regular basis. You know, the reality is that kind of dual voting in multiple states is actually very rare. It does happen, but it's very rare. And so we haven't seen a huge problem with it. Maryland has been allowing students to vote, essentially from, the first semester there on campus for a long time now. And to my knowledge, we've never had a single instance where a student in Maryland has cast a ballot in two different places.
Does the vote get canceled in one or the other place? What's the sanction? What's the enforcement? And what I'm concerned about is that, for example, the Congresswoman from Michigan depends a lot on students at the University of Michigan, which she didn't have this year because they voted at home. When it's a major part of your representation, it's going to be challenged. And you have to be pretty sure that you can answer that challenge, because we know what challenges happen now.
Yeah, and look, and unfortunately, there are a lot of false accusations about the about how common voter fraud is. It's something we face all the time, right? Maryland is not a state, for example, that requires voter ID at the polling place every time, right? And there's a bill that comes in every year that asks Maryland to institute voter ID, and the person presenting it almost always presents, sort of data that's not rooted in actual data, just loose assertions that voter fraud's a problem, and it's not very common. The voter fraud is a crime. If a person were to vote simultaneously in two different places, they would be prosecuted. And Maryland, like any other state, is not hesitant about prosecuting those crimes. So, for example, there were 3 instances. So the state of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of conversation about voter fraud there in the most recent presidential election. There have been 3 instances of voter fraud in the entire state of Pennsylvania from last fall's election that have been identified. All 3 of them are being prosecuted, right? And they will be. As a general practice, though, that constant checking of voter rolls that happens between states prevents the potential for it to occur in most instances.
All right. Next question.
I believe, is it Izada? Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but if you have a question, please feel free to talk.
Hi, it's Isata.
Isata, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, sir. Thanks for speaking with us today. I have a couple questions, but I will start with when you were recounting your story regarding getting more LGBT history and other groups' history into law. You didn't really speak on timeline, but I'm assuming it didn't happen right away. So my question is, how, when we are advocating, how do you make sure, or what are some of your advice on, staying energized, staying motivated, and then also making sure that the folks you are, specifically the legislators, that you are continuing to make sure that they're interested and they're engaged in sort of the process from, start to finish, ideally.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And look, I mentioned before, I was trained as a student organizer. One of the unique challenges of student organizing is that you have to constantly rebuild your organization. You have to constantly recruit new people because people graduate and they move away, and they're maybe not as involved in the advocacy, right? And you're absolutely right. Getting a policy change does not end when a bill passes or when the state superintendent of schools writes a letter. The implementation of policy can take years in some cases, and it's on one level, what you're asking is kind of a deep existential question about how you prevent burnout in advocacy, right? On that level, my best advice to anyone who's engaging in advocacy is to recognize that most activists experience burnout, right? Or there will be times where they're focused on other things. I myself have found, because I experienced the same challenge as a legislator, where an issue I worked on 5 years ago, maybe I haven't been focused on it in a while, right? I do find it's helpful for me to set goals in my goal setting in terms of advocacy, to think of things in terms of short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, right? And, that keeps me engaged in the work on a particular policy issue. I find it's also useful to remember that, the work of advocacy is hard work. Look, we're having big debates about policing reform right now. God bless the Black Lives Matter activists and the other folks who've been driving that conversation. It is not easy to get up for months and months and months and have to recount the same stories about people getting murdered violently, right? That's hard, right? And I think it's important for any advocate to remember that they have to do the work of sustaining themselves. They have to, be aware of their own mental and physical health. They have to remember that, if they're working so hard because they're passionate about it, they're working so hard that they're not eating meals, that's undermining their advocacy work. You're not as good of an advocate if you're not taking care of yourself. I think that's an absolutely vital piece of it. Is that kind of, if there's more, if I'm not fully answering your question.
No, that was good. Thank you. Cody, could I ask my second question, or I'm also happy to
Oh, no,
wait?
sure. Absolutely. Feel free.
My second question is just kind of random, but as far as voting reform, do you have any sense, I don't know the history about it, but sense as to why it's not a federal holiday or a state holiday? And if that's something that Maryland is even thinking about, working towards, folks are advocating for, just any background on that in general?
I don't know. Look, there was a long time in our history when people, didn't want folks to vote. I don't know if that has anything going back, any role in it. I think there was a time, certainly in Maryland's history, where it was informally a holiday. It used to be that, bluntly, election day meant going to a local bar and the party that you were supporting was buying you beer until you were drunk, right? So that was a bit of a holiday. But as to a formal holiday, in my time in Maryland, when that has been brought up, people will point out that because we've made mail-in voting a it's no fault, which means you don't have to have a reason why you want to cast your ballot by mail. You can just get a mail-in ballot. And because we have the early voting period now, that, the argument behind making election day itself a holiday is maybe not, the primary argument anymore, right? That it wouldn't have the impact that, people would say, or the people that it might have, say, 40 years ago. Now that said, I think that's kind of a dumb argument against it. I kind of think it should be a holiday. But that'll get opposed by there's no such thing as a policy idea that has zero opposition. So you make it a holiday, well, that means you're closing government offices, you're closing schools. The school boards will oppose that because they don't like the state telling them when to be open and when to be closed. There are people that'll raise the question of whether that creates learning loss or anything like that. You might have businesses say we don't want to be forced to close or anything like that, whatever it is. But again, I think those are dumb arguments.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat.
We can talk about other stuff too. We're debating a lot of issues in Annapolis. Policing reform. We introduced a Black economic empowerment agenda. There's cannabis legalization. All sorts of stuff being talked about.
Actually, can we talk about all three of those things?
Sure. So Maryland is a bit behind the curve on policing reform. Not necessarily criminal justice reform. We've actually done a good job trying to correct some of the worst consequences of the drug war and of mass incarceration. We, however, were the first state in America to pass a law called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is a law that offers additional due process protections for police officers that other people don't get. And, the progress that some other states have made in policing reforms has been beyond what Maryland has made. But, obviously there's been a tremendous increase in advocacy and activism and attention to the subject of policing reform. A little over a year ago, and this is not the only thing that matters in the debate, but it helps in the debate, Maryland elected for the first time a Black woman to serve as Speaker of the House of Delegates. So, you know, appointed a Black man to be chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, which is the Senate committee that deals with policing issues. So, you know, there's kind of the right leadership and the right advocacy at the right time. I think this session is going to see significant policing reform pass in Annapolis, repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, implementation of statewide use of force statute, bans on chokeholds, and some other activities, increase in training for law enforcement officers, changes to the Public Information Act to allow, in some situations, for police brutality records to be made public, even if it's an unsustained complaint against an officer. So, you know, I think that's likely. You know, at the same time, the Speaker of the House has made it a priority to try to address other components of the structural racism in our society. And so she has announced what she's calling the Black agenda, or the racial equity agenda, which is focused on healthcare and on wealth creation, and on housing. And it has a number of different components in it. But for example, trying to push Maryland-based companies to bring more business people of color onto their boards of directors, creating new protections to make sure that residents of color have an opportunity to get access to mortgages. So all sorts of pieces like that. And again, given the tenor of the national conversation right now, I think a lot of the pieces of that are likely to have a chance to pass. Although some of them, you know, a lot of bills take multiple years. Some of them may take multiple years. You know, on cannabis, you know, you're starting to see, so the states often riff off of each other in terms of making policy, and you'll see kind of one state kind of stick their neck out and do something really innovative. And then over time, other states will start, and there will be a tipping point where all the states basically do it. We're at that point in sports betting right now, where basically any state that has gambling is now legalizing sports betting. I think we're going to be at that place soon in terms of cannabis. The cannabis bill that's been introduced this year has been introduced by an MPP graduate, Jazz Lewis, who's one of my House colleagues, who built a bill that not only legalizes recreational cannabis, but tries to do so in a way that makes sure that, because, you know, the drug war was disproportionately prosecuted against communities of color, tries to make sure that minority-owned businesses have a real opportunity to get licenses and compete in the industry, goes back and expunges records of anyone who had a cannabis conviction over the years, puts a lot of money towards funding HBCUs and other programs that are specifically designed or specifically targeted at supporting communities of color. So, and that's an interesting variation on the bill. I don't think it's going to pass this year. I think it might take a little bit longer to pass. I mean, bluntly, one of the issues with the bill is that there's a real divide within the Black community about it, because I think there's a lot of, you know, younger folks who are all about legalization, and as long as it addresses these racial inequalities that exist in the drug war. But I think you got some older folks that just don't like weed, you know, and they don't want it to be legalized. And you know, that's playing out in the conversations as well. And I saw the question in chat about SROs, school resource officers. So there is a big debate going on about school resource officers right now. And actually, when I came here, I was just leaving a hearing. One of my colleagues, Janelle Wilkins, had introduced a bill to move some money away from law enforcement related to schools, although it's not specifically for SROs, and spend it instead on counseling services in schools. You know, the SRO debate is a complex one, and the social science around the impact of SROs is not very good. It's clear that around the country, the presence of SROs increases student arrest rates and Because SROs, because school police officers have more commonly been put into schools where the majority of students are students of color, that has contributed to disproportionality. There's some evidence now that it's the presence more than anything that's causing this, right? So there's a study that just came out in Florida. Florida massively expanded SROs after the Parkland shooting. And what was interesting in Florida is that many of the schools in areas with high minority populations already had school police officers. So the expansion of SROs in Florida was concentrated in majority white suburban and rural schools. And they saw a tremendous increase in the arrest rate of white students. It was the presence of SROs, right? So, so you can ask the question then, why do we even have SROs? And on the other hand, social science, and this is on, people in my field, has not done a good job looking at the other side of the equation, right? There hasn't been a ton of research into whether the claims about the benefits of SROs are true. Do they play an important role in mentoring? Do they play an important role in school safety? And in the absence of that research, in the absence of data, proponents of SROs are able to assert that SROs are good for schools without anybody being able to challenge that end of it. Maryland has taken a different tack on SROs than a lot of states. So, to your question, what is likely to happen with SROs? Maryland was the first state and is, I think, still the only state in the country that requires implicit bias training and training on the school to prison pipeline of all SROs and school security personnel. We did that a couple of years ago in a bill called the Safe to Learn Act. There's a bill that's been introduced the last couple of years, which would explicitly say that SROs are not allowed to engage in any issues related to normal school discipline. There are arrests that happen of students for example, disruption in the classroom, which is totally inappropriate. That's not the role of an SRO. It's different if an SRO, in my mind, if an SRO is arresting someone who has committed an assault, that's a different thing, right? But disruption, it's also a challenge because in a lot of cases, an SRO is making an arrest because not necessarily because they want to make an arrest, but because they're being asked or ordered to make an arrest, or because a parent, let's say two students get into a fight, and one of the parents wants to press charges against the other student, right? Well, then an arrest occurs, and it's not necessarily driven by the SRO. And that raises another question. So if you get rid of SROs, at a minimum, an SRO is a person who has some experience in that building and with that particular student population. That arrest is still going to happen because that parent is still making a complaint and asking for an arrest to occur. Is it going to happen by an SRO who maybe knows students and is trained to work with them, or is it going to happen by a beat cop who maybe doesn't have that training, right? And we saw an instance of that recently in Maryland where a 5-year-old girl essentially ran away from school, and a police officer is alleged to have picked her up and then essentially berated and threatened her all the way back to school, which is not the way to deal with a 5-year-old child. So, I'm curious what students have to say, because I think it's a complicated debate, and it's still very much an open debate, right? And the SRO issue is one part of this larger issue with the school to prison pipeline and making sure that all students in schools have, a safe learning environment. And that means trauma-informed practices, and it means restorative practices, and it means having adequate numbers of counselors and mental health professionals and social workers in schools. Does it also mean banning SROs? I think in Annapolis, the debate, there is not consensus on that question yet. But I think, I'd hope we're at consensus that SROs should not be the people who are primarily responsible for dealing with a kid who, for example, is just talking back to a teacher, right? So I'm hopeful that bill at a minimum will pass this year. That was a long answer to the SRO thing, sorry.
All right, does anyone else have any other questions?
We're going to see if we can get Professor Luedtke back on.
I'm here.
Okay. Well, you have to start over because in mid-sentence you froze. So
I think that might have been your screen, Aisha.
Oh.
Unless I'm mistaken, I think Leader Luedtke was everything was clear as far as the internet went. Unless maybe I'm.
No, look.
If you miss something, I'll feel free. But
here's another issue we need to solve: is inadequate broadband connectivity for Marylanders. That's another thing we got to fix.
I have one more question. I know that most officers in Maryland are supposed to be wearing body cams.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in the legislature right now about making sure that they turn them on? Just enforcing that whole thing, because what's the purpose of rolling out all these body cams if they're not going to keep them on?
Sure. And, so there are, I think, some bills in the Judiciary Committee that are being debated related to body cams. It's a more complicated issue than you might think. So, for example, that officer should be able to turn off the body camera in certain situations, like if they're using the restroom, right? Like that's a thing. And, but on the other hand, they should be on most of the time. My understanding of what the social science is saying about body cams is that they have served to provide more accountability in the sense that it allows people to see what actually happened during an incident, but it can't clear up every incident, and it hasn't necessarily prevented incidents. So yeah, most officers in Maryland are wearing body cams now. Most of them now, at least in their initial training, are being trained in a very different way than officers were a while ago. One of the other conversations about policing, and we haven't really dealt with it in the legislature, is just length of training. You don't need to have a college degree to become a police officer. So there are some departments that require it, and some folks that think you should, and that you should have deep training in like criminology and things like that. There's others who push back against that idea, but that training piece is a really important piece too.
We have a question in the chat. How to screen policy memos to be mindful of underserved communities, or what are strong indicators that policies will benefit the greater good of constituents?
Yeah, look, the latter question you're asking is a normative question, right? On any issue, there are disagreements about whether things benefit the greater good, right? It depends on your perception of what the greater good is. To your former question, how to make sure that policy that's made or policy that's recommended pays attention to issues of equity is a really important one. I think one answer to that is that all communities should have a seat at the table, right? I represent Montgomery County. Montgomery County prides itself on being a very diverse place. We did not have a Black woman representing Montgomery County in the legislature until 2015, which, I don't know how you call yourself diverse and then say you're addressing the needs of communities who don't even have a seat at the table. So I think that's part of the conversation, right? Is how do we make sure that people from all communities have a real opportunity to gain elected office and to be heard in the halls of power? I think also it's important to seek independent review. So on any bill that gets introduced, any policy that's created, at least through legislatures, you'll have a nonpartisan staff. For us, it's called the Department of Legislative Services. We'll look at it and create, they'll essentially offer some analysis, some policy analysis of the legislation. We call that a fiscal and policy note. And our fiscal and policy note looks at how much something's going to cost, and it looks at exactly what it's going to do. And we passed a requirement years ago where they specifically have to address whether it's going to have a meaningful impact on small businesses in Maryland. So there've been a proposal for a number of years now to require that those fiscal and policy notes also include a racial impact statement, that there be some analysis for the impact of the equity impact of policies. And 4 other states already have that. Montgomery County government already has it. The Speaker and the President of the Senate just announced, actually 2 days ago, on the first day of Black History Month, that we were going to start doing it for, at least for criminal justice bills in Maryland. We're going to start piloting it. So I think that's an important step. I think for policymakers, and particularly policymakers like me, it is important to recognize your own limitations. My experience in this world is completely different from somebody who is, whose skin is darker than mine, who's of a different gender, who isn't, a straight cisgendered man like me. And I think policymakers generally, particularly those of us who have benefited from privilege, need to first of all acknowledge that privilege, but be open to being challenged on that privilege and on our ideas. And I think you're starting to see that more, particularly among sort of the 20-somethings and 30-somethings that are getting elected to legislatures. I think is more part of the conversation. And I think the same is true of people doing policy analysis, right? Wherever they're doing it. Equity has to be part of what you're thinking about, or you are failing at your job.
We want to give everybody a chance to ask last-minute questions, but we also want you to kind of conclude with giving us a charge on how we as a policy school can be more engaged and participating in advocacy, and maybe just having a cause for different graduating groups coming up, maybe something that we can take on as a school and maybe groups of students.
Yeah, I mean, academia is sometimes called the ivory tower. And it's the ivory tower is isolating, right? I think it's natural on college campuses to be focused on research and things like that. The School of Public Policy, the public policy field, is uniquely a field that is grounded in the real world, not just thinking about policy issues, but actually trying to fix them, right? We regularly, our faculty and staff regularly move back and forth between the university and various governmental or nonprofit positions, right? We are grounded in the real world. But we're not necessarily grounded in advocacy. It's been relatively rare traditionally for the School of Public Policy, which has a lot of really brilliant people in it, to play a role in developing state level policy in Maryland. Hopkins does that. University of Maryland, Baltimore does that. College Park hasn't traditionally, and that's starting to change. It's starting to change because you've got some professors that are more engaged. For example, one of our professors who works on health policy, Rob Sprinkle, has been down to Annapolis a few times to lobby or to speak to healthcare bills in committees in Annapolis, right? It's not hard to do. Annapolis is right down the street. But I think, frankly, a lot of that advocacy needs to be driven within the school democratically, right? What is it that students and staff and faculty want to see changed in terms of policy? What expertise does the school have that it can apply? And now let's all hop in a car and drive to Annapolis and make it happen, right? I think students in particular, policy students in particular, are well positioned to play really key roles in creating social change in Annapolis. But it's that first step that's the hardest, right? It's the stepping up and saying, you know what, in addition to the job I'm working and the family I might be raising and the grades I'm worried about and my internship, I'm actually going to spend some time writing a letter to this guy I've never met in Annapolis telling him to vote for this bill. Or I'm actually going to take half a day and drive down to Annapolis and meet with somebody and encourage them. Or I'm going to take some time and write testimony and testify in favor of this bill, right? It has to be something that each of us decides to proactively do, and that is ultimately part of the responsibilities of being a member of our society, is exercising our voice. That's the only way democracy works.
We want to thank you for your time. Insight has been very resourceful, educational, all those things, and we hope to invite you back maybe after the session to go over some additional areas that are new and kind of burning within the school that we can address.
Sure, anytime.
And thank you. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a good one.